I gave a talk in late March. For some of you that were here, it was entitled The Dharma of Relationships. And I realized when I was writing the talk that I had bitten off way too much. And I sort of did an overview on that evening. So I want to do a series of follow-up talks to that one. So this is going to be The Dharma of Relationships Part 2. And hopefully there'll be a 3, 4, and 5. Let me briefly review the outline of that March talk before we get into tonight's subject. I talked in general about human relationships and how they're central to our experience as human beings and all the ways in which they're important to us. Everything from community, connection, safety, intimacy, procreation, cooperation, the list goes on and on. And relationships really are what make us human. I then talked about what I consider the primary relationship challenges for which the Dharma might offer some answers or solutions. And briefly, these are a belief in a permanent or separate self or an ego, that part of us which causes us to compete and want to win, causes us to feel self-important, narcissistic, sense of moral superiority, privilege, on and on, the separate self or ego. The second challenge that I spoke of is the absence of presence, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. The third of the challenges was relational grasping and clinging. By that I meant using the second noble truth of the cause of suffering as it applies to our relationships with others, the wish or belief that others should behave as we want them to, or having fixed expectations for how others should treat us. And then finally was emotional reactivity, and that's usually born of the first three. That's where we sort of have a hair trigger, get emotionally reactive in the face of any perceived relationship threat. And that one is exacerbated by the threat bias that we all have from evolution. So that's a big one in itself. Someone approached me after my last talk and said, your talks are just so serious. You need to lighten things up a little bit. So with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a story in an attempt to lighten things up. So this involves a type of presence, as you'll see, sort of a presence of mind. And this is about a young man named Jim who'd recently gotten a job in a supermarket, been there about a week. And he was working in the produce department. That was his assignment. And he's working, and a gentleman comes in and says, excuse me, young man, I'd like to purchase a half of head of lettuce. So Jim's a little befuddled, and he says, well, I don't know. I'm new here. Let me go back and ask my manager. So he goes to the back of the store and says to his manager, some idiot out there wants to buy a half a head of lettuce. And he turns around just as he says that, and the gentleman is standing right there. So he says to his manager without skipping a beat, and this gentleman would like to buy the other half. Later, Jim is working, and the manager comes up to commend him for getting himself out of a difficult situation. And he says, so tell me about yourself. Where are you from? And Jim says, I'm originally from Canada. And he says, oh, Canada. Why did you leave? Why are you here in the States? What brought you here? And Jim says, I hated Canada. I just hated it. There's nothing there but hockey teams and prostitutes. And the manager says, my wife is from Canada. So without skipping a beat, Jim says, yeah, what team did she play for? So, in the interest of lightening things up, that's my story. So in my talk in March, I described presence as showing up for our relationships, listening actively, trying to understand, walking in the other person's shoes. And this certainly, the issue of presence, as you'll hear in a moment, also applies to ourselves, but in terms of presence with others. And as I thought about it, the question that came to mind was, which of the Noble Eightfold Path factors does presence really address, or address its presence, I should say? And I think we could argue that all of them, really, if we boil it down, but certainly three came to mind. Wise speech, which is refraining from malicious, harsh, and harmful speech. It was hard for me to imagine being present in a relationship without wise speech. Right effort in terms of overcoming the hindrances and the fetters. Again, showing up without those obstacles. And then certainly right mindfulness, which I think presence would be really unlikely without right mindfulness. So coming at presence from the other side, I touched on this briefly in March. What does it mean to not be present? What does that look like when we aren't showing up for our relationships? And there are many, many ways for us not to be present. We all experience those. But certainly if I'm defensive, if I'm judging you or judging me, if I'm criticizing you, if I'm dismissive of you, if I'm mocking you, if I'm not understanding or not trying to understand you, if I'm not giving you my undivided attention, if I'm indifferent, any and all of those ways would result in me not showing up, not being present. If I'm not remaining present for the difficulties and the challenges that any relationship presents us with. If I withdraw from you, if I push you away, again, I'm not going to be present. Tara Brach writes about presence a lot, speaks about it, and she says, quote, "We may want to love other people without holding back, to feel authentic, to breathe in the beauty around us, to dance and sing. Yet each day we listen to inner voices that keep our life small." Close quotes. Now, as I said a moment ago, we can also apply presence to ourselves. And by that I mean being present in the moment for whatever comes up. Just embracing whatever comes up. Not suppressing it, not denying it, not avoiding it. And I would argue that a prerequisite for being present with others is to first being present with ourselves. If I'm clear with what's going on with me, it's going to make it a lot easier for me to show up for you. This is Tara Brach again from her newest book, True Refuge. She says, "Each time you meet an old emotional pattern with presence, your awakening to truth can deepen. There's less identification with the self in the story and more ability to rest in the awareness that is witnessing what's happening. You become more able to abide in compassion, to remember and trust your true home. Rather than cycling repetitively through old conditioning, you are actually spiraling toward freedom." So I think presence is a key ingredient to our progress on our path. Those of you that heard Rick Hansen a few weeks ago talk about neuroscience research, which tells us we're really hardwired to connect. It's just hardwired into us as a species. The human brain, Daniel Goleman has called the human brain a social organ, really emphasizing the importance of connecting. And connecting is really, if we boil it down, a function of presence. Connecting really cannot happen in a true, meaningful way without presence. And we know when we're experiencing that presence and that connection, we're going to release the bonding hormones, oxytocin and dopamine. There's a physiological and biochemical correlate to this. And that intimacy, real intimacy with others, requires our being vulnerable, which is also a result of being present with ourselves. David White, the Irish writer and poet, says about vulnerability. He says, "Vulnerability is not a weakness, a passing indisposition, or something we can arrange to do without. Vulnerability is not a choice. Vulnerability is the underlying, ever-present and abiding undercurrent of our natural state. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. The attempt to be invulnerable is the vain attempt to be something we are not, and most especially, to close off our understanding of the grief of others. More seriously, refusing our vulnerability, we refuse the help needed at every turn of our existence and immobilize the essential, title, and conversational foundations of our identity. So I think there, he really makes the case that intimacy cannot exist without vulnerability, and vulnerability cannot exist without presence. They're all interrelated and interwoven. From Mary Oliver, called The Poet with His Face in His Hands. You want to cry aloud for your mistakes, but to tell the truth, the world doesn't need any more of that sound. So if you're going to do it and can't stop yourself, if your pretty mouth can't hold it in, at least go by yourself across the 40 fields and 40 dark inclines of rocks and water to the place where the falls are flinging out their white sheets like crazy. And there is a cave behind all that jubilation and water fun, and you can stand there under it and roar all you want, and nothing will be disturbed. You can drip with despair all afternoon and still on a green branch, its wings just lightly touched by the passing foil of the water. The thrush, puffing out its spotted breast, will sing of the perfect, stone-hard beauty of everything. So as we talk about most weeks here, mindfulness is really the full awareness of our actions, our thoughts, our bodily states, our feelings, our surroundings, our interactions in each moment with others. And it is bringing full presence to and awareness of our experience in the moment. As I said in March, to be present, we need to bring mindful awareness moment to moment to our interactions with others. We need to bring mindful awareness moment to moment with our interactions with others. And as hard as this is, and believe me, I think you know how hard it is, the beauty of presence is it provides a refuge. We feel connected, we feel safe, we feel secure, we feel validated. When we show up for each other, we both show up with presence, we derive all these benefits from the experience. If there's a lack of presence in our closest relationships, we feel unsafe, distrustful, alone, isolated. We know this, we can feel it. It's a familiar feeling. It's just not there. Another way to think about presence is really to talk about it as a stability of mindfulness. When presence is there, the mindfulness is stable. They're working in concert. So mindful presence creates an awareness of all that we do and all that we experience, moment to moment. It becomes a catalyst for self-reflection. It nurtures a sense of acceptance in our closest relationships. It helps us feel that connection, that bond. It creates safety for others when we are present and invites interaction from others. People know it when we show up, when we're present. People feel it. They can experience it. You know, this was something I so often felt in my working life when I was doing psychotherapy. You know, clients could really feel whether I was there or not. If I was off a day, boy, they would pick it up in a minute if I didn't show up. You know, people often say, oh, that's the easiest job in the world. You just sit there and listen for 45 minutes, you get paid to do it. You know, if you're showing up, you go home exhausted. Believe me, those of you that are therapists know what I'm talking about. This is from Rumi. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. I love that line. Let the beauty we love be what we do. So, as I said a few moments ago, presence is hard. It's difficult. It really is a challenge for us. And I had no idea in my own life what this was until middle age or maybe a little beyond. I just had no concept of it. It was just not part of the way anyone in my family interacted, anyone in my culture seemed to interact when I was growing up. Most of the interactions were fairly superficial. And without presence in our families or in our relationships growing up, I think we're vulnerable to feelings of loneliness, abandonment, isolation. We suffer. Presence is an antidote for that, but if we don't know it, we can't apply it. But we sure know that it feels pretty lousy when it's missing. And to talk about it more psychologically, it's really the result of a lack of attunement from the other, be it a parent or someone else, a lack of attunement to our needs, and our lack of attunement to others. Tons of studies on that whole issue of attunement, infants and mother, the eye gaze, all of that work. When we feel someone is attuned to our needs, we really feel their presence. And when it's not there, there's a depleted emotional environment within which the child is developing. It's just not full, it's not rich, it's not meeting all that child's developmental needs. And as a result, we exist in what Tara Brach calls the trance. If you know her talks, know her writings, she talks about trance a lot. And it's really sort of autopilot. We're on autopilot. We're without awareness. We're just sort of going through the motions. And often, in response to this lack of presence, in response to this trance, we often feel fear, we often feel shame, we often feel anger. It's certainly true for me, all of those experiences. And I came out of that feeling highly reactive, highly defensive. It really made it impossible for me to even feel someone's presence, much less offer it. I had walls up, I had armor on. It really made presence impossible. And contrast this with true presence, which Tara Brach calls a true refuge, the title of her latest book. Real presence is a true refuge. So I knew something important was missing in my life. I just had no idea what it was. I experienced a void, a sort of emotional hunger. Just sort of was wandering in the wilderness trying to figure out what was going on. So my solution was I was going to be perfect. That was the answer if I was perfect. I would just try harder. I wasn't trying hard enough. Boy, but that's a fool's game if you've ever been there. It's just not going to happen. Dana Falls, who's a poet, says, perfectionism is not a prerequisite for anything but pain. And boy, did I know that to be true. So as I said, my default mode became one of being very self-centered, very self-absorbed, very reactive, highly reactive. It was really impossible for me to give mindful presence to others or to myself. I was just living in a trance. Tara Brach says, we are born with a beautiful open spirit, alive with innocence and resilience, but we bring this goodness into a difficult world. So some years ago, into my practice, I began to make self-compassion and metta a more central part of my regular practice. And that began the process of starting to feel the grip of this trance loosening a little bit. And in some ways, that's the good news about suffering. If we can move from that position with some self-compassion, it really opens up the possibility of presence. It really opens up the possibility of connection. I don't know if this is his line or not, but Leonard Cohen, in his song Anthem, says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I really felt that as my practice began to address some of these issues. Because I began to accept things as they were, not as I wanted them to be. So a lot of that armor could start to sort of fall away. Robert Sexton, the writer, says, From day to day, nothing so surely defines the quality of our lives as the unwavering affirmation in the eyes, in the voices, in the presence of our friends. It is through them that we truly begin to know ourselves, and it is their affection that assures our dignity and worth. So once we can open to presence, then we open to the opportunities that he describes for the validation and the real affirmation that comes from that. So as we think about the barriers to mindful presence, in which there are many, but I'll talk about 5 of them briefly. What gets in the way? I think first and foremost is fear. That we feel threatened or unsafe in our relationships. We default to some protective mode, some armor mode. I'm afraid of being vulnerable. I'm afraid of embarrassment. I'm afraid of rejection. I'm afraid of appearing weak. Fear. Fear is driving me not to want to open to the full experience of presence. The second is desire, and by that I mean desire that others meet our needs without our having to ask, the wish or desire, hoping that you can anticipate my needs. I don't have to take the risk of asking. I don't have to take the risk of being turned down. You can read my mind. I don't have to tell you what my needs are. The third is judgment. Judgment of self or other is a barrier to presence. It's very hard to be in presence when I'm worried about how I look, or I'm judging myself about how I am, or you're judging yourself about how you are. I'm afraid of looking bad. That priority will override my capacity to be present with you. The fourth one is control. Here again, trying to control others, control ourselves, forcing our agenda on others. It's really a defense, I think, control against the uncertainty and the unpredictability of relationships. Relationships, there's not a roadmap. They go all kinds of different ways. And the need for control, I think, is a defense against that. But without accepting that unpredictability and that uncertainty, we can't fully bring presence to our interactions. We don't want surprises. Well, too bad. They're going to happen. And number 5 is the illusion, being unable to see things as they really are. Having to accept that things might be other than I wish them to be. Or maybe I'm not the person I thought I was. This construction that I created, maybe that's not really real. So any illusion, any denial of what's the reality of the situation. So on the flip side, then, what are some of the ingredients necessary for mindful presence? And again, there are many. I'll just mention 5. The first one is attention. Focusing on ourselves, bringing attention. Remember from RAIN, part of the RAIN equation, recognize, accept, investigate, non-identification, attention, bringing awareness and attention to what's going on with me, giving you my full attention, focusing on your needs, focusing on your feelings, bringing attunement to those those interactions. In other words, I show up for you. I show up for myself, and then I can show up for you. Second one is acceptance. Acceptance of your feelings, your choices, accepting it with respect, not trying to change you. Even if I don't like how things are, accepting that, respecting that. The third is appreciation, which is a deeper form of acceptance. Includes admiration, valuing, which is explicitly stated that I value you, I value what you bring to the relationship, and that I convey my acknowledgement of you as a person. I affirm that. The fourth is affection, fourth ingredient of presence. Physical and emotional expressions of love, wanting to be with the other person, validating them, being demonstrative. An important part of presence, especially in our intimate relationships. And then finally, allowing, by which I mean flexibility, letting you be who you are, not trying to control you, not trying to, respecting your choices, not trying to change who you are. So with those, I think, 5 ingredients, it's a good start in terms of bringing mindful presence to our relationships. This is a poem by David White, who I quoted earlier on vulnerability. It's called Start Close In. He says, start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing, close in, the step you don't want to take. Start with the ground you know, the pale ground beneath your feet, your own way of starting the conversation. Start with your own question. Give up on other people's questions. Don't let them smother something simple. To find another's voice, follow your own voice. Wait until that voice becomes a private ear listening to another. Start right now. Take a small step you can call your own. Don't follow someone else's heroics. Be humble and focused. Start close in. Don't mistake that other for your own. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing, close in, the step you don't want to take. So at this point you may be thinking, gee, Jeff, this is all well and good, but what about envy, jealousy, prejudice, possessiveness, resentment, pride? Not to mention the hindrances taught by the Buddha, greed, hatred, and delusion. And indeed, these are all challenges that we all wrestle with. But we cannot work with any of them or address any of them without moment-to-moment mindful awareness, without bringing mindful awareness to those emotional states or those mood states. For instance, what's coming up right now? Is it pride? Is it jealousy? Is it prejudice? We have to be open to that. And if we're judging ourselves for that, if we're judging ourselves for having these feelings, which all of us have at some point, then we're never going to get out of the starting gate. There has to be an acceptance within myself that, yeah, these come up. Yeah, I can work with these. But not if I'm denying them, repressing them, or pushing them away. Because once I start judging myself for any and all of these experiences, I'm foreclosing on my ability to overcome them, or to work with them, or to ever achieve presence for myself or others, because these are getting in the way. So the first step is to recognize, the first step that David White talks about is recognizing that each of them and other such feeling states are within all of us. They're part of our human experience, don't necessarily make us bad people, and that we can use our practice to manage them, to change our relationship with them, to bring mindfulness and clarity to them, to begin to manage our demons rather than let them manage us. And yes, they do hinder our journey on the path. And yes, they do keep us in a trance. And yes, they do preclude our ability to be fully present with ourselves and others. But we can work with them. We can bring mindful presence to them. We can use that presence to open our hearts to others, because without being able to open our hearts to others, it's going to be very difficult to show up, to be present. So I'd like to share with you, in closing, a recent personal experience. And this has to do with my 91-year-old mother, who is in assisted living over in the Shenandoah Valley. She grew up very pampered and privileged and indulged from a family in the Deep South before World War II. Is and how has always been very self-centered, very self-absorbed, coming out of that kind of background. And I grew up really resenting her for now what I understand to have been her lack of presence, for worrying about how her 4 children's behavior reflected on her rather than trying to show up for us. I didn't have a label for it then, but I really felt there was something major missing. And if you had been a fly on the wall, it was very subtle and very deceptive. If you had been a fly on the wall, you may not have seen this. Because as long as we were complying with her unknown and unspoken rules, it felt like presence. It felt like she was really there. The problem was it could turn on a dime, and for reasons you rarely understood or knew why it had gone 180 from feeling present to now being kind of frozen out. So as an adult, I carried this resentment my whole life. And in more recent years, I really began to see what a false refuge my resentment had become with her. And regardless of her behavior, just about my behavior, my attitude had precluded me from being present or trying to move things along with her in any different way. I would go see her sort of out of guilt and obligation. I'd spend a half an hour there. It would be very superficial. We'd talk about the kids or the weather or the food at her assisted living facility. It was just sort of going through the motions. I was really in a trance, and when I would go there. And as she's gotten older and more frail, she's now wheelchair bound. And with lots of meta practice, I began to just feel a little bit more compassion for her. The wheel started just to turn a little bit. And as I worked with that and have continued to work with that, and this really was somewhat of a surprise to me that it was happening. But as I worked with it, I could really start to feel my heart open with her. I could even acknowledge, and this was huge for me, for the first time in my life that despite all this other stuff, she'd really given me some gifts in terms of how to sort of be with people socially, just other aspects of the upbringing that some of the values that she had imparted and that had shaped who I am. So in recent history, when visiting her, I really make a conscious effort when I go to bring presence to our interactions. Not sit there and just wallow in my resentments. And it has allowed me to see and feel and hear her pain and her dissatisfaction with aging, with her frailty, with losing her faculties, with losing her friends, with coming to the end of her life. And so when she starts to become difficult and disapproving, which she still does, instead of being reactive, now I can engage her with humor. She's always had a good sense of humor. She likes to banter. She still has that capacity. So I'll just sort of try to engage her with that. But by first bringing presence to my own struggles with her, I was able to begin moving beyond them. And it has allowed me to bring more presence to my interactions with her. And it's really changed my experience of her, my experience of being with her. I don't resent it. I don't resent going there. I sense her pain and suffering. I can include her in my gratitude meditation now, which is something I never could do before. And I guess I've developed a really new appreciation of her that I never had before. And this has really felt like a gift in some ways. And I share this with you because I think it illustrates the power of mindful presence to really transform our relationships, including our difficult relationships. If we start with working on our own ability to be present and bring that to these other relationships, it can really shift things, even without the other person necessarily knowing what's going on. So going from the absence of presence as a challenge to being able to bring presence to relationships, I think is an important part of our path. So this is a poem by Derek Walcott. You may know this poem. It's called Love After Love. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread. Give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit. Feast on your life. So let's just sit for a couple minutes before we end. So thank you for your time and attention. Have a good evening.